Good evening, fellow Neverwinter players. Today I want to talk to you about the Ranger, and I'm going to have three distinct builds that we're going to be discussing today. The first build is going to be the Warden Melee build. Right now I have this set up for single target, though we'll talk how to make this AoE as well. This is going to be your best in slot build for the Ranger. The other two builds I'm going to talk about are viable alternatives for solo play and kind of lower end content, though in the right hands they can be fairly effective in near end game scenarios, but they require a lot more skill to run. But they can be some fun alternatives. So I'm not going to talk about equipment, boons, mount insignia, or companions in today's video. The truth is that there's very little variation between any of the DPS classes for best in slot in any of those items, and we can talk about that in a future video. So one call out, I'm going to kind of focus in on the powers on these builds and kind of talk a little bit about rotation. But one call out for the Warden Melee Ranger, a big chunk of its damage is actually classified as magic damage. So from an attribute point perspective, you're going to roll into intelligence and dexterity for the Melee Warden Ranger. So when we talk about the Melee Warden Ranger, we're going to look at the at-wills. So your primary go-to at will is going to be Storm Strike for single target. For AoE scenarios, you're going to be using Clear the Ground. When there's multiple enemies, when you get narrowed down to one, you're going to switch back over to Storm Strike. Storm Strike is your strongest at will power on the Ranger, and even though it's a little slow to cast, it's not terrible, and it does fantastic damage. From an encounter power perspective, you're going to run Hindering Strike. So one thing of note about Hindering Strike is that it is known to occasionally misfire, where you use your encounter power, it goes through the animation and records no hit and goes on to cooldown. If you look at your combat log, it will also record as never having hit. The Ranger isn't the only class with encounter power that does this. There are other classes with encounter powers, notably Steal Time on the Wizard, and of course there are others. The next encounter power we're going to talk about is Marauder's Rush. This one has a slightly longer cast time again. It's at 0.7 seconds cast time, so it can eat a little bit into your flurry proc, so you kind of want to be careful where you're using this, but it hits really hard and it's a really good encounter power to use. And then Boar Charge. Boar Charge is also fantastic hitting encounter power. Something to note is Throw Caution has a relatively low hit, but it does increase your damage. I don't use it. I've tested it a lot, and the damage loss on the magnitude loss on Throw Caution isn't made up for. So I don't use Throw Caution for any of my stuff right now. From a daily perspective, you're going to use Call of the Storm. Call of the Storm doesn't look like it's all that much, but it really ends up adding to a good chunk of damage in combination with all the stuff on your Ranger. So the Ranger doesn't have any gloriously large hits like the Rogue, especially on this build, but it does lots and lots of little chunks. The other daily that I run is Forest Ghost. I only run Forest Ghost for utility when I'm trying to lose aggro because the tank's not grabbing it back, or I'm in a solo situation where I'm completely surrounded by enemies, I'm losing health really fast, and I just need a quick breather to, get some encounters off cooldown or whatnot. From a class feature perspective, when I'm running single target against a boss, I run Seeker's Vengeance and Bladestorm, so I'm always working to get behind the enemy to take advantage of Seeker's Vengeance. And scenarios where you can't get a backside hitbox on an enemy, don't use Seeker's Vengeance and use one of the other class features. When you're in AoE scenarios, take Seeker's Vengeance off and run Twin Blade Storm instead. So you'd run Blade Storm and then Twin Blade Storm. From a feat perspective, when we're talking about single target in a melee, this really is the only set of feats to take. I'll even kind of talk a little bit about the last column here. So first off is focused. So mod 18, this is losing some damage, so you're losing about 5% bonus damage here on the focus feat. It still remains a fantastic feat. And again, the Warden single target in melee and in AoE is one of the strongest DPS classes in the game. Then I'm running Storm's Recovery. It's pretty simple. I run a melee encounter power. It reduces my other melee encounter power cooldowns. And of course, the bread and butter of the Warden melee build is Blade Hurricane. So from a rotation perspective, you're going to use an encounter power. You're going to use an at-will power for 3 seconds, or a one full rotation, so 1, 2, 3 hits, and then you're going to use the next encounter power, 1, 2, 3 hits, next encounter power, 1, 2, 3 hits, and then you just keep rinsing and repeating that cycle over and over again. Of course, mixing in dailies wherever you can, and so this is really ends up being quite a bit of damage. And then the other piece that's the bread and butter of this is this increase in crit severity. So this is another big call out here for mod 18. This used to reduce your crit strike by 3,000. It now reduces your crit strike by 10,000, and instead of giving you 30% crit severity, gives you 25% crit severity. Again, this is still a very strong feat, and crit strike being one of the easiest skills to gain in game from a points perspective, it shouldn't be hard to make up. And then the last column is enhanced conductivity. This is actually a much stronger feat than Nature's Envoy. I've done a lot of testing both ways. So if you were to run Nature's Envoy, you'd run, Force Ghost instead. But you should have Flurry up almost all the time anyway, and so this really doesn't give you much of a gain, whereas enhanced conductivity has that really great synergy with Call of the Storm. Okay, so the second build I'm going to talk about, I'm going to pop over to kind of a single target build. So this build is definitely not an AoE build. This is more for single target bosses. It does not put out as much damage, again, as the Warden melee, but it's a little safer. Even though I do have this designed to maximize its damage at point blank range due to one of the class features I'm running, it is still it still does somewhat decent damage, and it can be a lot of fun, just being a pure archer. Rather than having that bow on our back for decoration, it actually does something. So you can see that I have 2 at-wills. I have Rapid Shot and I have Aim Shot. Aim Shot damage over time is lower than Rapid Shot. On the Hunter side, Rapid Shot is your most damage over time at-will. You shouldn't be mixing Aim Shot in for really anything. The only reason why you have Aim Shot is in here is for the melee side of it, which is Aim Strike, which does apply a bleed. So what I find myself doing is I'll switch over to the melee stance, even though I'm kind of pure ranged on this. I'll drop that bleed down from that, as well as Gushing Wounds, the opposite of Long Strider Shot, just to put a little bit extra damage. But you're going to see below that we're actually, losing some of that damage, but that's okay. It's just a little bit extra damage, and it's pretty awesome. Another solid alternative to that is, if you're running a group, is running Careful Attack. Careful Attack isn't anywhere near as good as it used to be back in the glory days, but it's still a lot of fun to run, and it's still pretty decent in a group setting scenario. And then from an encounter powers perspective, I'm running Constricting Arrow, Long Strider Shot, and Commanding Shot. So if you're not running with a healing paladin, Stagheart is another thing I'll swap over to melee for, because it does grant 15% of your total hit points as temporary hit points. So you get a little tiny blue bar uh, on your health bar down there, which can be really helpful again in group content or even solo content for some survivability. And then from a daily power perspective, you're pretty much going to run disruptive shot, and nothing but disruptive shot. And again, it comes down to your feat selection of why we're doing that. But it only uses 25% of your total AP. It only has that 0.5 second cast time, and it has no cooldown time. So as long as you have AP, you can be casting this. That being said, you're not going to cast this more than every 5 seconds at the most. And again, I have Force Ghost on here for my lose aggro quick, but realize that it's using half your AP. So you want to try to avoid doing that if you can. Being a single target build, again, Seeker's Vengeance. I want to try to get behind the boss and stay behind the boss and hit from behind. And then I am using Aspect of the Falcon, which is giving me 10% more damage if I'm within 25 feet of my target. Generally speaking, 25 feet, if you can stay in that 20 to 25 feet range, you're not going to get hit by most of the melee encounter powers on a boss, but you're still going to have to do some dodging around. But it also keeps you close enough to get tight group heals, like from Bastion of Health on the Cleric, or Divine Shelter on the Paladin. From a feat perspective, you're going to run long shot, so this is about boosting your encounter power damage for your ranged encounters, but keep a note that it does reduce your melee encounter powers by 50%, so it's a give and take there. And then you're going to run, I run critical action, so every 25% action points I spend on a daily power grants me a stack of critical action. This increases my crit severity by 6% per stack for 10 seconds. So really, if you're looking at it, let's say I drop a disruptive shot and then wait 5 seconds and drop another disruptive shot. I've just increased my crit severity by 12%, right? Which is a nice damage boost. Then I'm running Predator. That's pretty self-explanatory. And then I'm running Commander-in-Chief. So this is not a rooting build. I am using one power here that is applying strong grasping roots, but that's not the bread and butter of this build. The commanding shot is a nice strong hit, and now I'm also reducing my encounter powers by 2 seconds. The cooldown on those just by using that. So from a melee, from a rotation perspective, encounter power rotation perspective, this is going to be the last encounter power I drop in a rotation cycle, so that I can maximize that cooldown. And then I'm using more than Disruptive. So Disruptive Shot increases your range damage by 10% for 5 seconds. So this is, again, I'm running Disruptive Shot as often as necessary, but I don't want to, blow it all out, right? So about once every 5 seconds, you want to drop Disruptive Shot, as long as you have the AP for it, and for that nice healthy damage increase. And then the last build I'm going to talk about is just kind of a rooting build on the Hunter. This build is a lot of fun to run. It is very demanding, and it is very timing sensitive. That being said, you can really pull some impressive numbers off of it for something that's a non-standard build, and it has a lot of throwback, nostalgia type of stuff back to the old Trapper Hunter Ranger. So from an at-will perspective, rapid shot, that's again your best hit here on this side, but you're also going to mix in careful attack into this list. So again, if you're running by yourself, not a big deal, but if you're running in a group, this can help the group quite a bit. But your main go-to is going to be rapid strike and rapid shot, depending how you go. And then your encounters, You're going to be running both hindering shot and hindering strike, so these both apply roots. You're going to be using constricting arrow and steel breeze. And then I've been mixing in cordon of arrows and plant growth. I find that these are a little faster to mix in than using like a long striders, which is a harder hit. Plus, plant growth also applies weak grasping roots. Granted, those weak grasping roots don't get converted into strong grasping roots and thorn roots, but it gives you a little bit more control again, which gives you more breathing space, especially when you're running solo, or if you're running with somebody that maybe has a companion that gives bonus damage when a target's controlled. From a daily perspective, I'm still running Disruptive Shot. Again, it uses only a quarter of your AP, and I can leverage that more than Disruptive down below. That being said, this is kind of more of a control buffing build. So you also have Slasher's Mark. Slasher's Mark has a fantastic magnitude hit, and it really can help a tank in a party where they're having trouble maintaining and gaining divinity. So there's lots of places, especially Paladin tanks, have a really difficult time gaining divinity in some of those lower end dungeons, and this could really help your tank out. And then from a class feature perspective, you're going to run Crushing Roots. Again, basically your weak grasping roots now daze the target for half a second, and your strong grasping roots dazes your targets for a second. So again, you're dazing your targets. You're applying all those roots all the time. You're consistently dazing those targets, especially in campaign zones. Granted, in dungeons, there's a lot of enemies that are immune to those, so you could go with a different route. And then we're also running Aspect of the Serpent. So Aspect of the Serpent is all about stance switching and gaining damage through stance switching. And then from a feat perspective, we're running Rate of Change. So you gain a 5% damage boost when switching stances. This bonus is reduced by 1% per second and refreshes to full on your next stance stage. And then we're running Thorned Roots. So again, strong grasping roots are upgraded to Thorn Roots, which deal 50 magnitude damage every second. When hitting a control immune target, they just deal an additional 150 magnitude damage. And then Biting Snares. Again, all about the roots. And then Forest Bound, again, all about the roots. We're applying grasping roots and reducing the cooldown powers, and then we also have more than Disruptive. So the rotation for this is really going to be use a power, stance switch, use a power, stance switch, use a power, stance switch. You're going to be constantly switching stances with this. Alternatively, use a power, stance switch, use the same, so you could use a melee encounter power, stance switch. So then you use another melee encounter power, and then do another double stance switch, use another melee encounter power, do a single stance switch, use your ranged encounter power, double stance switch, ranged encounter power, double stance switch, ranged encounter power. So you can see that keeping it nice and fluid and smooth is really important to this build, but it also requires a lot of skill and a lot of nimble finger keyboard wizardry. But at that being said, that's all I have on these three distinct builds. If you have any questions, please hit me up on Twitch or leave a comment on the video. Thank you.